And then I come over to Indiana, which my dad was very upset about. He wanted me to play in Illinois. He wanted me to play in college. And I came to Oakland City. That's how I got to Indiana.
Oakland City College at
Yes.
the time?
Yes. And didn't play basketball. I had an academic scholarship. So that was an issue. And I remember my father going with me to Lagodi to see my room in the summer. And we walked in to the foyer there, and there were all those trophies. And we were just astounded because we both loved basketball. We didn't know anything about Lagodi. And
This is where your first job was
this
at.
is my first job. And so there was I remember the first two guys that were there, Wayne Flick and Jeff Meyer. Is that funny? And I remember the first two guys that were there. And Wayne's, one of the things when you write a book, and this one, the Larry Bird book was true of this, there'll be characters that'll just take over for a while. And Wayne Flick ended up being one of them, of all people. But he was there, and he was showing us the trophies. They had been runners up. Or no, they'd been in the state finals, and they were a small school. So they were kind of the Benton, Illinois, Indiana, where you had the small school that had the really super seasons, and was their coach. In Illinois, it was Richie Herron, and of course in Indiana, Lagodi, it was Jack Butcher. So my dad kind of made peace with that because he saw I was going to be at this really good basketball playing school. So that year, I was at a game that's in almost every Larry Bird book. It's mentioned the Lagodi Springs Valley game. You were there.
I was
you?
there.
That was my senior year. That was Larry's senior year, or my first year of teaching. It was Larry's senior year. And it was for the Blue Chip Conference Championship. Lagodi was undefeated at that time and would be undefeated till the last two games. And that was a game, an iconic game in high school basketball. I mean, Larry Bird was doing, if you look at those old reels, he looked like he was a Boston Celtic, taking those long shots and bringing the ball down. So he was hardly mentioned his junior year by any of the newspapers. That was the year of those seniors of Steve Land, who set all the records at Springs Valley, and a really good traditional basketball school. So that's amazing. And then you had Danny King, who later on played at Indiana State. He played 1 year with Larry. And then you had Tony Clark. Those were the seniors. And then you had Larry, and then you had Brad Bird, who was a year behind Larry. And that game, this gets me into something about the book. When I started writing the Larry Bird story, I found out, like I did in writing my own book here, Almost Perfect Season, that my memory of the games were about 50% wrong. And not just about how I over remembered myself as being better. Sometimes I was better than I thought I was, but I was wrong about 50% of the time. And I found that out by looking at the old newspapers and these scorebooks here. So scorebooks, old newspapers, box scores were amazing because they gave you the grist of the stories. And all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, this doesn't fit in with the narratives. So here's some freebies for you here in the book, if we can get to that. That game between Lagodi and Springs Valley. You remember the story where Larry scored at the wrong goal, and that was the difference in the game? That's how it's stated in all the books. Now, I don't know how that got started. That was misunderstood. It might have been the first book that Larry's aunt wrote. But at any rate, that wasn't the case. He did score, but it didn't count. He walked. It did give Lagodi the possession of the ball. If you remember, that was a back and forth game all the way through.
It ended up being 3 points at the end.
Yes, in the three, and it was really one, but a technical gave us 2. So it was a 1-point game for all purposes. And Valley was ahead much of the time. The other thing that's in there in the story, well, this isn't in the story, but it was missed. The key part was captured, and I want to talk about sports writers for just a moment, because sports writers are amazing of that day, of that, what I call that golden age, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, before class basketball, basically. Aren't we old timers here? Still talk about that being the better time, but it did change basketball, the world that we knew. Larry had been, do you remember Larry being knocked out for a while? What, for maybe seconds?
Probably.
He's on the floor, and he was stunned. And I won't tell you who it was, but I found out later. what Lagodi guy did that. You probably know which one it was.
Mhm.
It wasn't Wayne Flick.
Right.
In this case.
Right.
It was another big, you look,
Another story in the book that you'll enjoy reading.
but that cost him a timeout. And that was the difference in the game, if you remember. That timeout lost.
Timeout late in the game.
Late in the game. What they called and they didn't have the timeout, gave the ball back to Lagodi, and that changed the whole complexity of the game.
I think when you spoke to me early on with the book, and where you were landing with the title. And I think I was up front, when I hear by magic, having watched Larry that senior year, and then I fast forward the playoff game with the Indiana Pacers later in his career, where he hits the floor hard in the face and has to leave and be treated, then comes back. Larry's career wasn't developed from magic itself in the grand aspect of things.
No.
And as you further develop the book, it began to correlate with me where the magic part comes in at. First, before I get too far away, what has always impressed me and the impact as a 14-year-old for me was just the work ethic of Larry and just how the team bred off of him with work ethic. That was Larry at Indiana State. That was Larry at the Boston Celtics. That was Larry as an executive. That was Larry as a coach. That's where his Hall of Fame career. That's why he and Magic Johnson, while Magic looked like it was so much easier at times, and Larry had to work harder, there's not a doubt in my mind Magic was working just as hard in that aspect. But they turned the league around and in many ways saved it. But where I was going, the magic component, as I hear in your title, as you and I have spoke about the book, and it really goes to, okay, Dr. Mills is going to write the story of Larry's senior year. But as you're writing it, you go back into the 1960s and some previous coaches, other individuals from other communities come into play in that link, and even players who preceded Larry. Because some of the things that I went back to, and I was just pondering this before we sat down to record today, one of the early memories I have, going to school at Springs Valley, was Jim Jones of the Blackhawks winning that 1969 Huntingburg sectional.
Yes.
Defeating Jasper, in the first game by about 9 or 10 points. Big. Nobody thought we would win that, but that front line they had, with Noble and
then they beat a really good Holland team.
Well, they beat Holland, dominated. Well, they beat Du Bois at the time in the semifinal, dominated by about 17, 18 points. Beat Holland by 20, maybe a score of 54-34. It doesn't matter. Then they upset state-ranked New Albany. Had to come from behind. We're down 13, 14 points. They had to come from behind to win the first game of the regional. That stood out to me. And I think about, as you talk to me about your title and what you're doing with the book, and here's Larry in 1974, I saw that team. I saw the 1971 team with Larry's brother, Mark, who played at Oakland City.
Yes.
And
when I was there, yes.
And James Beezer Carnes, who was a guard on Larry's senior year team, his brother Kevin was on that 71 team. Mark and Kevin, great players. They won the sectional in 71. Then I think about the 19-3 junior year team that Jim Jones and Steve Lamb in that team that didn't get out of the sectional in that regard, and how all of that built up. And I think that's the magic aspect. It's not magic as in, poof, here he is. It's magic in some of the pieces and the tentacles and the ties you wouldn't consider.
Let me play on that a little bit, because my first full chapter in the book is called Bidden or Unbidden, and it's about ghosts. And my contention in that chapter was that when Larry, every gym, every game Larry played in, that gym was packed full of ghosts. These traditions you're talking about. He did not play in a vacuum. He did not come to his greatness by himself. He stood on the shoulders of others. If I really believe if that Springs Valley tradition hadn't been there, we wouldn't have Larry Bird, because he was able by that. I don't think he understood it, but it was there. It had to be there. There was no getting around it. You walk into the gym and all those stories you told, you think of Charlie Carnes's last second shot against Jasper in 66. I mean, I could go on and on and on. The
1957-58 state finalists, Rex Wells, Marvin Pruitt, and that first team.
So here's Larry being born in this community with all that history, but if you would have asked anybody even his junior year, I don't think there would have been a soul that would have said he's going to be perhaps the best basketball player there played basketball. I think people would have said you were nuts. And that's kind of the if by magic thing. But what you see, and I go back to what came before, and when Larry walked into that gym and worked with his coaches, what had already happened. I think you got to understand that to understand how Larry got there, because that was there, and Larry was able to connect to that, whether he realized it or not, bidden or unbidden. It was going to happen to him once he immersed himself into that. But let's look at another angle here. Larry was okay. He was a good ball player. We're talking Indiana. We're talking Springs Valley. Everybody's a pretty good basketball player. You know what I mean? I don't think the rest of the nation realizes that. When I was at Oakland City and we played intramural basketball, we'd have these kids from Missouri or other places, and we'd be choosing up teams and so forth. And that guy looks pretty good. That guy looks pretty good. You better have all Indiana guys, Missouri guys. They were good at football. They could tackle, and they do it. But yeah, we're talking Indiana basketball. But even then, I don't think anybody saw Larry coming. If they would have, let's think about this. Jim Jones, I think he started 62, 63. Yeah, that was his first year. And I have a lot about Jim Jones because he's just basic to the game of shaping Larry.
Won 700 games in his career.
Yes, but not at Springs Valley. He was, what was he, 150 and 100? Yeah. I mean, he did well. He won sectionals and things, but he didn't always have.
Spent roughly 11 years at Springs Valley, then went to Princeton for 11 years, and then moved on to Terre Haute North the rest of his career.
He didn't always have the horses, but he did great with what he had. I mean, he was famous for bringing them around and somehow getting good teams out of teams that didn't look that good. And
Coach Jones actually finished his career for a couple of years back at Springs Valley. Yeah.
So Larry played biddy ball. He played seventh grade basketball, and I've got all the and I've got a little bit of things from newspapers with Larry's name in it. So Larry was playing, but he wasn't the best player, but he was a pretty solid player. And then he got kicked off the team his eighth grade year. And then his freshman year, I think he had an early injury in football probably, but he says himself, he didn't play a lot. I wasn't able to completely confirm that, because when you look at Larry's story, he's talking from the past, and I don't think Larry valued memory a whole lot. And a lot of people just don't remember stuff. And even then you don't remember it right, as I mentioned in my stuff. Larry was the not most valuable player, but he won the free throw award his freshman year. So in Larry's own biography, he said, I just wasn't that interested in basketball. So how did that happen? When did that happen? Well, Larry said, he said this about 3 events. He said, I had this magical moment, but he said that about three different times of how he got there. And these are all in the book. But even those moments are, when you look back at the box scores and so forth, they're not quite correct, but they are in spirit. And I talk about this in the book. I'm doing some correcting here. And when I started doing that, probing that and putting some stuff on Facebook, I got some pushback because it didn't fit all the sacred narrative. Larry Bird, in some ways, like Abraham Lincoln, he really is. He's iconic. I mean, just like that, the people we were talking on that trip, I believe if you go up to any guy our age, more or less, anywhere in the United States, and you say Larry Bird, they'll more than know what you're talking about. And you would say that about Lincoln too. And so many people have these Larry Bird stories. But again, I think one of the things I tried to do, and these scorebooks were very helpful in doing that, was setting the record straight. I gave that guy a freebie that I was talking to the other day. Because he said, yeah, number 33. And I said, well, that was Mark Bird's number. And so I've got a chapter called Number 33 in the book, and it's not about Larry, it's about Mark. And in fact, there's Mark runs throughout the story, as does Jim Jones, and as does that 72-70 team that Larry was on. And I call that the forgotten season.
That's a fun team to watch too.
It was a fun team to watch. They were great. They were probably a stronger team than the next year. One thing that was magic, and Larry says this was the big difference. If you had to pick one thing, growing 4 inches.
Well, it had to be, yeah.
Growing 4 inches. So
between junior and senior year. Yeah.
So he played as a junior on an 18-2 team regular season, and they lost in an upset to Orleans, which probably wasn't an upset. Orleans was really good.
By Kurt Gilstrap, and McClintock.
Yeah. Stevens, I think, that year, and then McClintock and Gilstrap the next year. I'm going to come back to this thought, but I also want to say that one of the things in my book that I point out is that Larry wasn't always victorious, and neither was the team.